my way.
Where'd you get a move on, Mr. Cate?
As I said,
Cinderella is one of those stories we think we know so completely that we almost stop seeing it. We know the pumpkin, the glass slipper, the castle, the mice, the magical dress, the midnight escape, and the prince who searches an entire kingdom for the mysterious girl he met for only one evening. We know the ending before the story even begins. And because we know it so well, we often reduce Cinderella herself to the simplest possible image. A beautiful girl who suffers until magic arrives and a handsome prince rescues her. But watch the movie again as an adult, and that interpretation starts to feel strangely incomplete. Because Cinderella is not simply waiting. She is surviving. Almost every part of her life has been taken away from her. Her parents are gone. Her home, which should have been a place of safety, has become a controlled environment where another woman decides what she wears, where she sleeps, how she spends her time, and how much of her own life she is allowed to possess. Lady Tremaine controls the household not through spectacular violence, but through hierarchy. Cinderella works. Her stepsisters command. The doors close. The attic becomes her bedroom. The beautiful house still exists, but Cinderella has effectively been removed from the life happening inside it. And that distinction matters, because Cinderella has almost no institutional power. She cannot simply leave. She cannot summon the authorities. She cannot overpower Lady Tremaine. She does not possess money, social influence, or a family willing to defend her. Her resistance therefore happens somewhere Lady Tremaine cannot completely reach, inside her. That is what makes Cinderella such an interesting heroine. She refuses to let cruelty become her personality. She is exhausted, but she remains kind. She is humiliated, but she still jokes with the animals around her. She is isolated, but she creates relationships. She is repeatedly told, directly and indirectly, that she is less important than everyone else in the house, yet she never fully accepts that definition of herself. And that creates the central question of the entire movie. Is Cinderella passive, or is she enduring? Those two things may look identical from the outside, but psychologically they are completely different. Surrender means giving up the belief that another life is possible. Endurance means continuing to believe it even when there is no immediate evidence that it will happen. Cinderella lives in that space. Her famous song, "A dream is a wish your heart makes," is therefore more important than it first appears. It is not simply a pretty musical number introducing a princess. It establishes the internal world of a woman whose external world has become almost unbearable. Her dream is not yet a plan. It is not even a guarantee. It is simply proof that the life around her has not completely conquered her imagination. That distinction becomes even more important when the fairy godmother eventually appears. The fairy godmother does not create Cinderella's desire to attend the ball. She does not give Cinderella her identity. She does not suddenly make Cinderella worthy of love. She accelerates something that was already there. The magic opens a door, but Cinderella is the person who is still standing in front of it. And then there is the slipper. The glass slipper is usually remembered as a romantic object, but it also functions as something much more powerful. Evidence. It proves that the mysterious woman at the ball and the supposedly insignificant servant in the attic are the same person. The magical transformation changes her clothes, her transportation, and her surroundings, but it does not change who she is. The slipper survives the transformation. So does she. And perhaps that is why millions of people grew up with Cinderella without realizing how much of the story is really about dignity. The fantasy is colorful, but underneath the fantasy is a darker emotional situation. What happens when the people who control your environment repeatedly attempt to convince you that you are worth less than you are? Cinderella's answer is remarkably quiet. She keeps hoping. And that may be the most radical thing she does. This video is going to move beyond the familiar plot recap and look at Cinderella as something much larger. A product of Disney's post-war history, a technological achievement in animation, a carefully engineered piece of musical storytelling, a psychological portrait of endurance, and eventually one of the most influential fairy tale images in popular culture. We will follow Cinderella from the traditions that existed long before Disney, touch the story to the studio's desperate need for a major theatrical success. We will examine why Lady Tremaine can be more frightening than villains with supernatural powers, why the mice are essential to the film's emotional balance, why the prince is intentionally underdeveloped, and why the fairy godmother appears for such a short time yet becomes one of the most recognizable figures in Disney history. We will look closely at "A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes." So this is love, and bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. Because the music is doing far more than decorating the story. It is giving Cinderella an interior voice, turning emotional states into melodies, and helping the audience understand feelings that the dialogue barely explains. We will also examine the transformation sequence, The contrast between Cinderella's attic and the palace, the symbolism of doors, stairs, clocks, clothing, pumpkins, carriages, and especially the glass slipper. Because if the slipper only meant romance, it would be a strangely fragile foundation for an entire cultural mythology. It means recognition. It means proof. It means that the woman everyone ignored was always there. And then there is the larger question of history. Cinderella arrived in 1950, at a moment when Disney needed the film to succeed. The studio had spent years navigating the disruptions of war, changing markets, expensive productions, and financial uncertainty. This was not simply another fairy tale being added to an already successful catalog. Cinderella represented a return to the kind of feature animation that had once transformed Disney into a cultural institution. Its success therefore mattered far beyond one princess. It helped demonstrate that the fairy tale could once again become a commercial engine, that music and merchandising could extend a film beyond the theater, and that a character could become more valuable than the 90-minute story in which audiences first encountered her. And perhaps most importantly, Cinderella survived. She survived theatrical re-releases, television, home video, VHS tapes, DVDs, merchandise, theme parks, Halloween costumes, weddings, adaptations, remakes, changing ideas about gender, and generations of children who encountered the story in completely different cultural environments. That survival is worth investigating, because plenty of movies become successful. Far fewer become shorthand for an idea. Cinderella's story is now a phrase people use even when they are not talking about fairy tales. A glass slipper can communicate an entire narrative without showing a single character. A pumpkin carriage can instantly suggest transformation. And the image of someone going from overlooked to celebrated has become one of the most durable emotional formulas in popular storytelling. But before Cinderella became a cultural symbol, she was simply a child watching her life change. Most of us encountered that child through the glow of a television screen, perhaps on VHS or DVD, perhaps through a broadcast watched again and again, perhaps through a picture book that made the castle seem impossibly distant and the slipper impossibly beautiful. We remember the fantasy. We remember the mice. We remember the dress. We remember the castle. But childhood memories have a strange way of protecting the emotional details while hiding their implications. As children, we may have understood Cinderella as someone who wanted to go to a ball. As adults, we can recognize that the ball represents something much bigger. Access to a world from which she has been deliberately excluded. We may have laughed when the stepsisters destroyed her dress. As adults, the scene can feel less like slapstick and more like psychological cruelty. We may have celebrated when the fairy godmother appeared. But now we can ask what makes that magic emotionally satisfying in the first place. And we may have thought the slipper proved that Cinderella was special. Now we can ask a different question. What if the slipper proves that she was never required to become someone else at all? That is the deeper journey through Cinderella. Not simply from servant to princess, but from being unseen to being recognized. And if you think you already know this movie, that is precisely what makes it worth looking at again. Because sometimes the stories we think we remember best are the stories we have never really examined. Part 2. Context Background. Long before Disney's Cinderella appeared in 1950, the basic story had already traveled through centuries of human storytelling. There was no single original Cinderella, because the idea existed in different forms across different cultures and periods. Stories about mistreated young women, impossible social barriers, mysterious transformations, Lost objects and sudden recognition appeared long before Walt Disney ever placed his characters inside a painted background. But one of the most influential versions came from Charles Perrault, whose late 17th century telling helped establish many of the elements that modern audiences now consider essential. The pumpkin carriage, the fairy godmother, the glass slipper, the midnight deadline, and the transformation of ordinary life into royal spectacle all belong strongly to the tradition that Disney inherited. The Brothers Grimm later offered a substantially darker version. Their Cinderella story contains a harsher atmosphere, greater violence, and a more severe moral universe. The contrast is revealing because it demonstrates what Disney was actually doing. Disney was not inventing Cinderella. Disney was editing the cultural memory of Cinderella. The studio took a story with roots in cruelty and social inequality and translated it into a form built around music, comedy, warmth, visual elegance, and emotional accessibility. That process had already transformed Snow White. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had demonstrated that an animated feature could be more than a novelty. It could carry emotion, character, suspense, music, and dramatic structure. But Snow White had also created enormous financial and production pressures. Disney's later years were complicated by expensive projects, wartime restrictions, international market disruptions, and a changing economic environment. During the war, the studio increasingly relied on package films and shorter productions. These projects were useful under difficult circumstances, but they were not the same as returning to the grand feature film model that had defined Disney's early ambition. By the time Cinderella entered development, the stakes were significant. The studio needed something recognizable. It needed something emotionally accessible. And it needed something audiences would actually pay to see. A familiar fairy tale offered all three. The challenge was that familiarity could also become a weakness. If audiences already knew the basic story, why would they need another version? The answer was character. Disney's Cinderella could not simply repeat the plot. She needed to become emotionally readable within seconds. Her personality had to be established through behavior rather than long explanations. She had to be gentle without becoming bland, hopeful without becoming unrealistic, and vulnerable without becoming completely helpless. The story department therefore had to solve a delicate problem. How do you make a heroine sympathetic when most of her dramatic situation involves things happening to her? The answer was to surround her with life. The mice gave her a community. Lucifer gave the household a comic predator. The stepfamily created constant interpersonal pressure. The palace provided a parallel world. The king and Grand Duke provided a second comic rhythm. And music gave Cinderella an interior life. The mice were particularly important because Cinderella's emotional world could otherwise become unbearably isolated. Jack and Gus were not merely there to make children laugh. They gave Cinderella relationships that were not based on hierarchy. In the household, everyone above her commands her. With the mice, she can communicate, care, joke, and participate. They are, in effect, her surrogate family. Lucifer serves the opposite function. He represents the household's hostility in physical form. He does not need to understand Cinderella's social position. His instinctive antagonism turns the domestic environment into a miniature battlefield. And then there is Lady Tremaine. The decision to make her a human villain rather than a supernatural one was crucial. She does not need a curse. She does not need a magic wand. She does not need to transform into a monster. She simply understands power. Her weapon is control over space, resources, attention, and approval. She can make Cinderella work longer. She can assign her the worst room. She can encourage Anastasia and Drizella to treat her as inferior. She can promise Cinderella an opportunity and then attach conditions designed to make that opportunity impossible. This kind of villainy is quieter than a dragon, but it can feel more recognizable. That realism gives the fantasy something to push against. The visual development of the film had to make that contrast immediate. Cinderella's world could not look completely miserable, because then the audience would understand the situation, but lose the sense of beauty that makes the fantasy emotionally rewarding. Instead, the film creates a world where beautiful objects exist inside oppressive arrangements. The house is elegant. The life is not. The palace is magnificent. But Cinderella's attic is where she sleeps. Her clothing is visually associated with labor. Her ball gown becomes associated with possibility. The transformation therefore changes not simply what Cinderella looks like, but what the audience is allowed to imagine for her. This is where music becomes essential. A song can tell us that Cinderella's dreams are alive before the plot has given her any external reason to believe they will come true. Comedy can prevent the story from becoming relentlessly tragic. Fantasy can provide emotional release without pretending that the original problem never existed. That balance became one of the film's defining strengths. Cinderella had to be sentimental, but not unbearable. Funny but not frivolous. Romantic but not entirely dependent on romance. Magical but emotionally grounded. And the studio had to make all of this work at a moment when the economics of animation were increasingly important. The late 1940s and early 1950s were not simply a period of artistic transition. They were a period of changing entertainment habits. Audiences were returning from wartime disruption to a culture increasingly shaped by television, mass consumer products, celebrity, music, and new forms of visual entertainment. Theatrical animation still carried enormous prestige, but it was expensive. A successful animated feature therefore had to do more than sell tickets. Could generate songs. Could create recognizable characters. It could inspire toys and clothing. It could strengthen the Disney name. It could be re-released. It could eventually become part of a child's home life. Cinderella was especially suited to this ecosystem because the story already contained visual symbols that could exist independently of the film. A slipper, a carriage, a castle, a crown, a ball gown, a pumpkin. These were not merely plot objects. They were merchandising language. They could become illustrations, toys, costumes, decorations, and eventually components of a much larger princess mythology. But before any of that could happen, the film had to work. Disney audiences already remembered Snow White. That created expectations. A new princess could not simply be beautiful. She had to be memorable. At the same time, competition existed across the entertainment industry. Animation was no longer an experiment associated with one studio alone. Audiences had increasingly sophisticated expectations for comedy, visual storytelling, and character design. Cinderella therefore represented a gamble. The recognizable fairy tale reduced one kind of risk because people already understood the basic premise. But the production itself remained expensive, and the studio needed the emotional execution to justify the investment. The cultural moment also mattered. Post-war America was developing new ideas about domestic life, consumer prosperity, family structure, and social mobility. Cinderella's fantasy of moving from confinement into an entirely different social world could resonate powerfully within that environment. Her transformation is extreme, but the desire behind it is ordinary. The desire to be noticed, to be chosen, to be allowed into the room, to discover that the life you were told was all you could have was not actually the limit of your existence. That is why the fairy tale could function simultaneously as romance and social fantasy. The audience already knew the ending. The question was whether Disney could make them emotionally want the ending anyway. And when Cinderella finally arrived, the answer would have consequences that extended far beyond the film itself. Part 3 Story Recap. Cinderella begins with a memory of a life that has already disappeared. She once lived in a loving household with her father, surrounded by security and affection. But fairy tales often begin by removing the thing that made life safe. And Cinderella's father eventually dies. The loss leaves her vulnerable to the woman he married, Lady Tremaine, who enters the story not as a monster, but as someone who understands exactly how to reorganize a household around herself. The transformation is gradual. Cinderella does not suddenly wake up one morning and discover that she is a prisoner. Instead, her status changes piece by piece. The family structure changes. The priorities of the house change. Anastasia and Drizella receive attention. Cinderella receives responsibilities. The home remains standing, but her place within it steadily disappears. Eventually, she is effectively a servant in the very house that once belonged to her family. Her bedroom is moved into the attic. Her days are consumed by chores. Her value is measured by usefulness. And yet the opening does something important by refusing to make Cinderella emotionally dead. She wakes up with personality. She interacts with animals. She sings. She jokes. She responds to absurdity with humor. That morning routine becomes one of the film's most revealing sequences because the workload is enormous. Yet Cinderella moves through it with an almost practiced efficiency. She has learned how to survive this environment. And she is not alone. The mice inhabit the margins of the household alongside her. Jack and Gus become especially important because they provide companionship in a world where Cinderella's human relationships are almost entirely hierarchical. Then there is Lucifer. Lucifer is not simply a funny cat. He is the embodiment of domestic antagonism. Where Cinderella's animals represent cooperation and belonging, Lucifer represents territorial control. His relationship with the mice turns the house into a constant comic conflict. Above all of this stands Lady Tremaine. She rarely needs to explain herself. Her authority is already understood. That is what makes the announcement of the royal ball so significant. The king has decided that the prince should find a bride. The palace will hold a grand event, and every eligible young woman in the kingdom is effectively invited. For Cinderella, this is not merely a chance to meet a prince. It is an opportunity to leave the boundaries of the household, even if only for one night. For the first time, the outside world appears to be opening. She asks to attend. Lady Tremaine does not simply say no. Instead, she creates a conditional promise. If Cinderella finishes her enormous list of chores and finds something suitable to wear, perhaps she may go. It is technically an opportunity, but the structure of the challenge makes the intended outcome obvious. Cinderella is supposed to fail. The mice, however, begin working with her. They recognize that Cinderella needs more than encouragement. She needs something tangible to wear. So they secretly assemble the materials and create a dress from the resources available to them. It is one of the film's most charming expressions of community. Cinderella's household treats her as disposable. The mice treat her as someone worth helping. When Cinderella sings, "A dream is a wish your heart makes," the song connects her external desire to her internal resilience. The dream is simple. She wants to attend the ball. But beneath that desire is something more fundamental. She wants evidence that the world outside her household still exists. For a brief moment, the dream seems possible. Then Anastasia and Drizella notice the dress. What follows is one of the film's cruelest moments because Cinderella's stepsisters do not simply dislike the dress. They destroy the evidence that Cinderella belongs at the ball. They tear it apart. The dream collapses in seconds, and Cinderella finally breaks. This is important because the film allows her resilience to have a limit. She does not remain endlessly cheerful. She retreats outside and cries because the situation has become too painful to contain. Only then does the fairy godmother appear. Her entrance is almost the visual opposite of everything that came before. Darkness becomes light. Ordinary objects become magical. A pumpkin becomes a carriage. Animals become horses and attendants. Cinderella's ruined clothing becomes a magnificent gown. But the transformation works emotionally, because the audience has already watched Cinderella struggle. Magic would mean very little if she had not first wanted something. The fairy godmother does not teach her to dream. She makes the dream temporarily possible. And then she gives Cinderella one warning. Midnight. The magic has an expiration time. That deadline is what keeps the fantasy from becoming permanent. Cinderella is not being transported into another universe. She is being given a narrow opening. One night. One chance. One temporary suspension of the rules that have governed her life. When Cinderella arrives at the palace, the contrast is immediate. Her home is defined by chores, restrictions, and surveillance. The palace is defined by music, light, movement, and possibility. Yet Cinderella does not enter as a conqueror. She enters unnoticed. The prince is surrounded by women who have been brought to him specifically for the purpose of marriage, but he has little interest in the spectacle. The formal arrangement feels artificial. Then Cinderella appears, and suddenly the entire atmosphere changes. The prince becomes interested in the one person who was not part of the expected performance. That matters. Cinderella is anonymous, and anonymity gives her a strange kind of freedom. No one at the palace knows what she is supposed to be. No one is ordering her to scrub a floor. No one is evaluating her usefulness. For the first time in the film, Cinderella exists without the label imposed on her by her household. She dances. She laughs. She experiences the possibility of being treated as an equal. So This Is Love captures the emotional speed of the encounter. The romance is intentionally compressed, almost dreamlike, because the entire evening itself is a dreamlike interruption. The audience knows the clock is moving. Cinderella knows the clock is moving. The prince does not yet understand the urgency. Then midnight approaches. The fantasy begins to fracture. Cinderella runs. She leaves behind the carriage, the gown, the magic, and eventually one glass slipper. The prince now has only a trace of the woman he met. The transformation disappears. Cinderella returns home. The carriage is a pumpkin again. The animals are themselves again. The gown is gone. Yet something has changed. Cinderella now knows that another version of her life is possible. And that knowledge is dangerous to Lady Tremaine. The royal search begins. The Grand Duke travels through the kingdom carrying the slipper that has become the only physical evidence of Cinderella's identity. The prince's representative is not searching for a social category. He is searching for a specific person. Lady Tremaine recognizes the threat. If Cinderella is identified, the household's entire hierarchy may collapse. The slipper therefore becomes more than a romantic object. It becomes a challenge to the system. Cinderella's identity has been hidden, but now the outside world is asking for proof. Lady Tremaine responds by trying to make sure that proof never reaches Cinderella. She traps her in the attic. It is a literal version of the psychological confinement that has defined Cinderella's life. The door closes. The royal search reaches the house, and the mice understand what is happening. Jack and Gus organize themselves. The animals move through the house like a tiny resistance network. Bruno becomes involved. Lucifer becomes the obstacle. The comedy suddenly becomes suspense. This is one of Disney's most effective structural tricks. The film has spent so much time making the mice funny that when they are placed in genuine danger, the audience already cares about them. The Grand Duke arrives. Lady Tremaine tries to control the situation. Cinderella remains trapped. The slipper is brought forward. For a moment, it appears that the entire story might end without her ever being recognized. Then the mice deliver the key. Cinderella escapes. The slipper is presented, and Lady Tremaine makes one final attempt to destroy the possibility of recognition. The slipper breaks. The apparent proof is gone. But Cinderella has something Lady Tremaine did not know about. The second slipper. The object that seemed to identify a mysterious woman now identifies Cinderella. The revelation is simple, but its emotional meaning is enormous. The magical woman from the ball was never someone separate. She was Cinderella. The servant and the princess were always the same person. The slipper fits. The truth becomes undeniable. Lady Tremaine's control collapses because it was based on controlling access to recognition. Once Cinderella can prove who she is, the hierarchy that defined the household no longer has the same power. The ending is remarkably uncomplicated. Cinderella's future changes. The prince will marry her. She leaves the household. The royal world accepts her. Justice is restored through recognition rather than revenge. And perhaps that simplicity is exactly why the ending works. Cinderella does not defeat Lady Tremaine in combat. She does not expose her publicly. She does not destroy the house. She simply proves that the identity Lady Tremaine attempted to erase was real all along. The story ends not because Cinderella becomes someone new, but because the world finally sees the person who was already there. Part 4. Character Analysis. Cinderella's surface goal is obvious. She wants to attend the ball. But if that were truly all she wanted, the story would be much smaller. The deeper goal is possibility. She wants to know whether the world can still contain something other than the life she has been assigned. Her psychological wound begins with loss. She loses her parents, then loses her position within her own household, and eventually loses the ordinary freedoms that would allow her to imagine a future. Her exploitation is not simply physical. It is emotional displacement. She belongs to the house and yet does not belong in it. That contradiction defines her. Her relationship with the animals becomes important because they offer a form of belonging that the human household denies her. She can be vulnerable around them. She can laugh. She can care for them. She can express affection without being punished for it. Her humor is also a survival mechanism. Cinderella does not joke because nothing hurts. She jokes because pain cannot be allowed to become the only thing she experiences. This is why describing her as merely passive misses something essential. She does not have unlimited agency, but limited agency is not the same as no agency. She chooses to ask to attend the ball. She chooses to keep dreaming. She chooses to accept the fairy godmother's help. She chooses to go. She chooses to leave when midnight approaches. And after returning home, she continues to believe that what happened was real. Her most important act is persistence. That persistence is internal rather than physical, which makes it easy to overlook. Modern storytelling often associates agency with action, confrontation, rebellion, or victory. Cinderella offers a different model. Sometimes agency is the refusal to allow circumstances to define the limits of your identity. Of course, the character has limitations. Her transformation depends heavily on external magic. The romance develops rapidly. The prince is barely characterized. The ending equates romantic and social rescue in ways modern audiences may question. But those weaknesses exist alongside something emotionally durable. Cinderella's internal identity survives. Lady Tremaine represents the opposite philosophy. She believes that control is maintained by managing the environment around other people. She controls resources, schedules, clothing, space, attention, and approval. She rarely needs to scream because the household already understands the consequences of displeasing her. That calmness is what makes her frightening. A theatrical villain announces evil. Lady Tremaine performs normality. She can appear respectable while creating an atmosphere of constant humiliation. Her motivation is not explained through a tragic origin or grand ideology. Her psychology is built around hierarchy. Anastasia and Drizella are favored because they reinforce her preferred social order. Cinderella is threatening because she does not fit comfortably into that order. The ball becomes dangerous because it creates a possibility Lady Tremaine cannot supervise. If Cinderella enters the outside world, someone might see her. If someone sees her, someone might recognize her worth. If someone recognizes her, the household's hierarchy becomes unstable. That is why the destruction of Cinderella's dress is more important than it first appears. The dress represents access. Lady Tremaine's response is to destroy access before Cinderella can use it. The attic later becomes the physical extension of that control. Cinderella is literally locked away from the person who might identify her. Lady Tremaine's great failure, however, is believing that control over space equals control over identity. It does not. And the supporting cast makes that conflict emotionally bearable. Jack is the organizer. Gus is the lovable chaos machine. Together, the mice function as Cinderella's surrogate community. Their communication often works through movement, expression, rhythm, and sound rather than conventional dialogue. Lucifer is their opposite. He is visual comedy transformed into threat. His rivalry with the mice creates a second conflict running parallel to Cinderella's larger struggle. Bruno adds another layer, becoming part of the animal community, while also providing a direct counterweight to Lucifer. Anastasia and Drizella are exaggerated extensions of Lady Tremaine. Their personalities differ, but both reinforce the same basic social hierarchy. Their comedy makes them ridiculous, yet their treatment of Cinderella remains cruel. The King and Grand Duke create another tonal layer. The King is emotional, impatient, theatrical, and frequently ridiculous. The Grand Duke is more controlled, functioning as the straight man who has to manage royal chaos. Prince Charming, meanwhile, is less a fully developed psychological character than a symbolic figure. He represents access to a different social world. That can be frustrating if we expect modern character development, but it also explains why the film does not spend much time exploring his personality. The emotional center is Cinderella's transformation of circumstance, not the prince's internal journey. The ensemble keeps the movie from becoming oppressive. Without the mice, the household could feel unbearable. Without the king and Grand Duke, the palace could feel too formal. Without Lucifer, the animal sequences would lose their central comic conflict. Every supporting character creates movement around Cinderella, and that movement reinforces the central idea of belonging. Cinderella is surrounded by people and animals who define different kinds of relationships: domination, companionship, rivalry, authority, romance, and recognition. The question is not simply who loves Cinderella. It is who sees her. Part 5 themes symbolism. At its core, Cinderella is a story about hope under conditions designed to destroy hope. That is why a dream is a wish your heart makes functions almost like the film's thesis statement. Cinderella's dream is not powerful because it guarantees success. It is powerful because it refuses despair. She lives in an environment where reality constantly tells her to lower her expectations. Her response is to maintain an imagined future. That does not mean wishing is enough. The movie itself eventually distinguishes between dreaming and surrendering. Cinderella's dream creates emotional movement. When the opportunity appears, she acts on it. She asks to attend the ball. She accepts the transformation. She leaves the house. Hope precedes magic. The magic does not create hope. That distinction is crucial. The film is also concerned with identity under oppression. Cinderella's environment repeatedly tells her that she is a servant. Yet the audience is shown that the label is false. Her social position is not her complete identity. This is where class becomes important. The ball is not merely a romantic event. It is a doorway into a social class from which Cinderella has been excluded. Her transformation gives her access to clothing, transportation, and a physical space associated with privilege. The fairy tale therefore dramatizes a fantasy of social mobility. One night can apparently erase years of restriction. That is emotionally powerful, but also culturally complicated. The film suggests that external recognition can change a person's life dramatically. Cinderella's inner worth exists before anyone acknowledges it, yet her circumstances remain trapped until someone outside the household recognizes her. That tension between internal worth and external recognition runs through the entire story. Kindness also becomes a form of resistance. Cinderella could become cruel. The environment almost invites it. But she does not. Her kindness is not presented as weakness. It becomes the quality that keeps her psychologically separate from Lady Tremaine. The villain survives through control. The heroine survives through connection. The visual symbolism reinforces these themes. Cinderella's attic is a space above the household, and yet outside its social life. It is physically elevated but socially degraded. The castle is the opposite. Enormous, open, brightly illuminated, and filled with movement. The house contains locked doors. The palace contains possibilities. The staircase becomes particularly meaningful because movement up and down repeatedly reflects social movement. Cinderella can move through the house physically while remaining trapped socially. The pumpkin is an ordinary object transformed into extraordinary transportation. That transformation is temporary, which makes it a perfect symbol for the fantasy itself. The carriage is not Cinderella's permanent escape. It is a vehicle carrying her toward possibility. The clock represents time as both opportunity and threat. Midnight is the boundary between fantasy and reality. The clothing transformation works in a similar way. Clothes communicate social identity. Cinderella's work clothes tell the household what role she occupies. The ball gown tells the outside world to see her differently. But the slipper is different. The dress can disappear. The carriage can become a pumpkin. The magic can vanish. The slipper remains. That is why the slipper carries the deepest symbolic weight. Proves continuity. The magical Cinderella and the ordinary Cinderella are not two people. They are one. This becomes even more meaningful when we think about the psychological experience of being unseen. Being ignored for long enough can make a person question whether recognition is even possible. Cinderella does not simply want admiration. She wants confirmation that her existence matters beyond her usefulness. The ball provides that confirmation. The prince does not know her history. He does not know she is a servant. He responds to the person in front of him. That creates another ambiguity. Does the prince love Cinderella? Or does he love the mystery of the woman he met? The film does not spend enough time answering that question. And that is one reason the romance feels more symbolic than psychologically developed. The marriage is also presented as social escape. For modern audiences, that can feel limiting. But the fairy tale's historical structure was never primarily concerned with contemporary ideas of romantic partnership. It was concerned with status, recognition, fortune, and transformation. Cinderella becomes desirable because the world finally sees her as desirable. That can be interpreted as a problem. It can also be interpreted as the story's way of dramatizing a deeper emotional truth. People want to be seen beyond the roles that have been assigned to them. The film's post-war context adds another layer. After years of uncertainty, disruption, and sacrifice, the fantasy of suddenly entering a brighter world could carry unusual emotional power. Cinderella's transformation is not simply about becoming wealthy. It is about leaving scarcity and humiliation behind. The fairy tale offers certainty where real life offers none. That is one reason it remains so adaptable. Different generations can change what the transformation means. For one audience, it may mean romance. For another, independence. For another, social mobility. For another, simply the hope that a terrible situation does not have to remain permanent. And perhaps that flexibility is one of Cinderella's greatest strengths. The film never needs to explain all of these meanings directly. Fantasy allows the audience to feel them first. The visual craftsmanship of Cinderella is easy to underestimate because the finished film feels effortless. But effortless-looking animation is usually the result of enormous effort. Cinderella had to move gracefully without becoming weightless. Lady Tremaine had to communicate authority without exaggerated villain movements. The mice needed expressive physicality small enough to feel believable, but broad enough to remain readable. Every character operates according to a different animation language. Cinderella's movements are controlled and elegant. Even when she is doing chores, there is a sense of grace in her posture. Lady Tremaine moves with restraint. She does not waste motion because she does not need to prove that she controls the room. Lucifer is different. He moves like a creature whose entire personality exists in physical reactions. The mice operate through speed, rhythm, and improvisation. These differences make the world feel populated by individuals, rather than drawings moving through a background. The transformation sequence is the most obvious demonstration of technical ambition. A pumpkin becomes a carriage. Animals become horses and attendants. Rags become a ball gown. The sequence depends on effects animation, timing, visual rhythm, and carefully coordinated movement. The magic has to feel continuous, even though the viewer knows that a series of separate visual transformations is occurring. The sparkles and light effects are not simply decoration. They create the sensation that ordinary matter is being reorganized. The transformation also provides a major visual escalation. The film begins in an intimate domestic world. Then, almost suddenly, the scale expands. The carriage is larger. The environment becomes brighter. The clothing becomes more elaborate. The palace opens the frame. The film repeatedly contrasts small spaces with expansive ones. The attic is cramped. The palace is enormous. The household is cluttered with objects associated with labor. The ballroom is filled with movement associated with celebration. Background design therefore participates in storytelling. The house is not merely a location. It is a system. The palace is not merely a location either. It is an image of possibility. Lighting reinforces the contrast. Domestic scenes can contain darker, more controlled compositions, while magical and royal sequences emphasize brightness and spectacle. Camera movement also becomes important. Animation can easily feel visually static if staging is not carefully planned. Cinderella uses movement to direct attention, establish scale, and create emotional transitions. The film's staging reflects Disney's broader interest in cinematic storytelling. Characters are not simply presented. They are framed, revealed, hidden, and contrasted. The animation also benefits from the studio's growing understanding of character acting. A raised eyebrow can communicate judgment. Pause can communicate hesitation. A slight movement of the mouth can establish annoyance. Lady Tremaine is particularly dependent on this subtlety. Her power exists in small gestures. That makes her animation almost the opposite of the fairy godmothers. The fairy godmother can be broad, magical, and exuberant because her purpose is concentrated intervention. Lady Tremaine has to feel believable. This contrast reflects the film's larger tonal strategy. Fantasy becomes more effective when the ordinary world has convincing physical rules. The mice run. The cat stalks. The clock ticks. Fabric moves. Doors close. Then magic interrupts that realism. The result is that the transformation feels like a genuine event, rather than a random visual trick. The film's directorial philosophy is similarly balanced. Cinderella is not constructed as a single uninterrupted narrative line. It moves between different centers of action. Cinderella's household, the mice, Lucifer, the palace, the king, the Grand Duke, Lady Tremaine. This parallel structure keeps the pacing alive. Whenever one storyline risks becoming emotionally heavy, another provides contrast. Cinderella's suffering can be followed by comedy. The palace's romance can be interrupted by royal absurdity. The mice can create suspense while Cinderella is physically absent. That rhythm is part of why the film remains watchable decades later. The story itself is simple. The presentation is not. Disney's story-first philosophy meant that every sequence needed to accomplish more than one thing. Comedy could establish character. Music could reveal psychology. Animation could communicate hierarchy. Backgrounds could establish mood. The prince's simplicity is also part of this approach. The film does not spend extensive time developing him because the emotional complexity is located elsewhere. Cinderella's internal world is the center. The prince is the doorway through which the fantasy becomes possible. The fairy godmother functions similarly. She appears when the story needs acceleration. She does not need a long subplot. Her concentrated presence makes the transformation feel miraculous. The creative system behind Cinderella therefore depends on compression. The film has limited time. It cannot explain every character, so it uses visual shorthand, a gesture, a song, a costume, comic reaction, a repeated action. The audience learns who people are by watching them behave. That is one reason the movie can feel emotionally rich despite having a relatively simple plot. Its complexity is embedded in presentation. Part 7: Music Sound. Cinderella's music is one of the reasons the film can communicate emotions that the dialogue itself barely articulates. The songs give Cinderella an interior voice. A dream is a wish your heart makes establishes her emotional philosophy before the plot offers her any reason for optimism. The melody is gentle, but the meaning is more resilient than the surface sweetness suggests. The song tells the audience that Cinderella still possesses an internal world that Lady Tremaine cannot fully control. That is why it works as a thematic foundation. Later, "So This Is Love" shifts the emotional register. The music creates a sense of suspension, as though ordinary time has stopped. Cinderella is experiencing a feeling that her domestic life has never allowed her to experience freely. The sequence is not simply romantic. It is about emotional possibility. For a few minutes, Cinderella is not working. She is not obeying. She is not hiding. She is simply experiencing. Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo provides a completely different musical identity. It is playful, rhythmic, almost absurdly energetic, and perfectly suited to the fairy godmother's personality. The song turns transformation into entertainment, while still making the moment feel emotionally significant. This contrast is important. The movie does not use one musical style for everything. Hope sounds different from comedy. Romance sounds different from magic. Suspense sounds different from domestic conflict. That variety gives the film emotional architecture. Music also helps create recurring associations. Certain sounds and musical moods become attached to particular characters or situations. The audience learns to feel what is coming before it fully arrives. The score can make fantasy feel inevitable. The transformation does not feel like an arbitrary interruption, because the music prepares the audience emotionally for the change. Sound design adds another layer. The world of Cinderella is unusually tactile. We hear footsteps, fabric moves, needles and sewing create rhythmic textures. The mice make tiny sounds as they work. Lucifer's movements become comic punctuation. The clock becomes increasingly important as midnight approaches. The sound of time passing becomes suspense. The ticking does not need dialogue. It tells us that the fantasy is ending. This is one of the great advantages of animation. Ordinary physical sounds can be exaggerated without breaking the world. A mouse can produce a rhythm that becomes almost musical. A cat's movement can become a comic beat. The sound of a door closing can feel like a dramatic event. Silence is equally important. Before major emotional moments, the film can reduce the amount of sound and allow the audience to focus. Then music or effects return with greater impact. The midnight sequence depends heavily on rhythm. The clock becomes louder in our attention, even when the visual world remains beautiful. Cinderella's escape becomes a race against sound. The glass slipper also becomes important, because it is both a visual and auditory object. Feels delicate. Its presence carries suspense because the audience understands its fragility. The transformation sequence combines musical timing with sound effects, so that visual changes feel synchronized rather than random. That synchronization is part of Disney's storytelling language. Music, movement, and sound are working together. The result is that Cinderella often communicates without explanation. A character does not need to say, "I am frightened." The score can tell us. She does not need to announce, "I am free." The music can tell us. The clock does not need to say, "Midnight is approaching." The sound tells us. This is why the movie feels emotionally legible even to very young viewers. Children may not understand the mechanics of orchestration, but they understand emotional rhythm. They know when the music feels hopeful. They know when it feels dangerous. They know when the world has become magical. And decades later, they can hear a few notes and immediately return to the emotional world of the film. That is not just nostalgia. It is the power of musical memory. Part 8. Cultural Impact. When Cinderella arrived, audiences were not simply receiving another version of a fairy tale. They were receiving a return to a particular kind of Disney spectacle. The film offered recognizable characters, memorable songs, magical transformation, romance, comedy, and a visual language that could be understood almost immediately. That accessibility mattered. Audiences did not need extensive background information. They already knew the basic fairy tale structure. The pleasure came from seeing Disney's version of it. Cinderella became recognizable not only as a character but as an image. The dress, the carriage, the slipper, the castle, the fairy godmother, the mice. These elements could circulate independently. The fairy godmother became especially memorable because she represented concentrated wish fulfillment. The mice offered comic appeal. Cinderella herself embodied the fantasy of being underestimated and then recognized. The film therefore had an unusual ability to appeal across age groups. Children could enjoy the magic and comedy. Adults could appreciate the romance and nostalgia. Families could share the experience. And because the imagery was so clear, the movie translated naturally into merchandise. Cinderella's long-term survival became even more pronounced once audiences could encounter her outside the theater. Television exposure introduced the film to children who had never seen it theatrically. Home video changed the relationship again. A theatrical film could become something a family owned. VHS tapes could be replayed. DVDs could preserve the experience. Children could watch the same transformation sequence repeatedly. The character could become part of childhood, rather than simply part of a movie-going experience. Eventually, Cinderella became one of the central figures associated with the broader Disney princess mythology. That category transformed individual characters into a shared cultural universe. Cinderella's imagery fit naturally within it. Princess costumes became part of childhood play. The castle became associated with Disney itself. The glass slipper became an instantly recognizable symbol. The Cinderella story also entered everyday language. People began using Cinderella story to describe unexpected success in sports, entertainment, business, and ordinary life. That phrase demonstrates something important. The cultural meaning of Cinderella eventually escaped the original plot. The story became a metaphor. A person can be overlooked and then suddenly recognized. A team can be dismissed and then win. Someone from an unexpected background can achieve extraordinary success. The phrase works because almost everyone understands the emotional structure. Long-term influence also appears in adaptations. Cinderella has been retold repeatedly because the basic framework is flexible. Filmmakers can emphasize romance, comedy, independence, social class, family conflict, fantasy, or psychological resilience. That adaptability is one reason the story remains culturally useful. The fantasy can change while the emotional skeleton remains. Modern audiences may question the idea that marriage should function as the ultimate reward. They may want Cinderella to have more direct agency. They may want the prince to have a more developed personality. They may reinterpret the fairy godmother's intervention. But the desire underneath the story remains recognizable. People still want to believe that being unseen does not mean being insignificant. That is why the story continues to work with younger generations who have grown up in a completely different media environment. The images remain legible. A glass slipper still means Cinderella. A pumpkin carriage still means transformation. A midnight deadline still means opportunity disappearing. And a person stepping out of an oppressive environment into a world that finally recognizes them remains emotionally powerful. Part 9. Critical Analysis. The most interesting debate surrounding Cinderella is not whether the film is good or bad. It is why both admiration and criticism make sense. From an artistic perspective, the film has obvious strengths. Its animation is elegant. Its songs are memorable. Its character design is expressive. Its pacing remains effective. Its visual contrasts are clear. Its comedy gives the story warmth. Its emotional structure is easy to understand. Audiences who love Cinderella often respond to exactly these qualities. The nostalgia is powerful because the movie is built around images that imprint themselves early. But modern criticism raises legitimate questions. Cinderella does not receive the kind of active, problem-solving arc that many contemporary heroines receive. The most dramatic changes in her circumstances come through external intervention. The fairy godmother appears. The prince becomes interested. The royal search begins. The slipper provides proof. From one perspective, Cinderella is waiting for rescue. From another, the story is showing a woman whose choices are constrained by a system she cannot realistically overthrow alone. Both readings can exist. The prince is another limitation. He is charming in the literal sense, but he is not deeply characterized. The romance develops quickly, and the audience is expected to accept the emotional importance of the relationship with limited information. That works if the prince is understood symbolically. It is less satisfying if we expect a detailed romantic character study. Historical context matters here. The film